there's permafrost thawing all over the world.
Of course there is.
I mean, it's NBC, CBS.
Yeah, permafrost, and it's a fascinating stuff. It means permanently frozen ground, but the ground isn't frozen. It's the water in the ground that's frozen. All right, and you've got basically two kinds of permafrost. You've got permanent permafrost, that is, the ground is frozen. If you thaw it out, it will refreeze. You've also got what is called temporary or relic permafrost. That is permafrost left over from the last ice age. So, for example, when I talked about that ice sheet that covered 1/3 of North America, the ground became frozen underneath that as permafrost. But as the glacier has retreated, and in northern or central and northern Canada, now it's been gone for about 8,000 years, the permafrost line has been retreating all of that time. But there are still some areas, if your listeners want to go and look at a map of Manitoba, there's a town called Thompson, and this is a measure of how our geography minds are wrong. They talk about Thompson as being northern Manitoba. In fact, it's right in the center of Manitoba. There are building lots in the city of Thompson where the council rule that you cannot build on it unless you build it on your house on stilts, or you get steam heat in and thaw out the permafrost that's still there.
Why?
Okay. Well, because the soil is a very, very poor conductor of heat. And so it's if you put some ice out and cover it with dirt, a certain depth of dirt, that ice will remain frozen for a very long time. And so this ground that was frozen, during the last ice age is still not thawed out yet. But of course, as the world warms up, gradually the heat gets down into the ground and it thaws it out. Now, in the area of the permanent permafrost, every summer, the ground that's exposed, the upper layer of it will thaw out. That's called the active layer. And it can vary in depth. And it can be a problem, by the way, the permafrost. Just to give you a quick little story, when Franklin and his expedition they died up there. They spent hours and days trying to dig a grave to give a proper Christian burial, and they couldn't do it. And the town of Churchill, what they would do is in the summer, they would dig the graves they needed for the coming winter. They'd estimate how many people were going to die. And of course, then when the local the Eskimos or Inuits, as we call them, and the Dene people, the Aboriginal people, said, "Hey, you're tempting fate. That's not a good thing to do." And so what they do now is they've got a special device that they sit over the area where they want the grave, and they thaw out the ground with a lot of heat. And so they only thaw out the graves that they need. But once the person is put into that permafrost grave, they remain, they don't decay. They're frozen. And one of the situations I got involved with a Dr. Ewart was that there were people buried at York Factory on Hudson Bay in this permafrost, and in the cemetery at York Factory, 80% of them had died of smallpox. And what Dr. Ewart was afraid of was that the government were planning to clear the bush and the willow scrub, and that would have allowed the ground to thaw out. And he was afraid that this smallpox, which had supposedly been eradicated on a world basis, would become active and live again. As I said, the bodies are intact. And you can read about those, the Franklin expedition, the bodies that were exposed. What's his name? Owen Geiger, the author. I'm trying to think of his name. He wrote a book about it, Frozen in Time. Okay. About these bodies frozen permanently in the ice. And of course, they're marvelous for science to learn about. And it's from those bodies, by the way, they found that the Franklin expedition died of lead poisoning because they could test the lead flesh. But anyway, so that the active layer thaws out. That's, of course, one of the things that makes any development in the north problematic, because here you've got ground earth that's thawed out, very, very saturated because it was frozen in the wintertime, and it's sitting on a layer of ice. And so you get this land moving or flowing, and it creates incredible landscapes and features. It's a process called solifluction. And of course, soli is soil and fluxion is flow. And you get these features of stones being sorted into geometric patterns and stripes down the sides of hillsides. And the early explorers thought that these were simply done by the local people. But in fact, they're part of the natural landscape of a permafrost region and this active layer that thaws out every summer.
I just saw the book, by the way. It's called Frozen in Time, The Fate of the Franklin Expedition, Owen Beatty and John Geiger.
Yeah, and I hate to mention that because I gave them all the what the weather was like for that period of time when Franklin was in that region. If you look in the book, you'll find me referenced in there. But anyway, and Dr. Ewart, by the way, the book that we did on the naturalists of Hudson Bay, 18th century naturalists of Hudson Bay, we dedicated our book to Dr. Ewart because sadly, before he could retire and work full-time at the medical records of the Hudson Bay Company archives, he passed away. But his work on the smallpox in those graves was very important work. But anyway, these permafrost. Then what happens is that when it thaws out, of course, it's very saturated. It becomes swampland. Now they call it in the Arctic region it's muskeg, and of course there's certain vegetation that grows in it. The major one is sphagnum moss. Sphagnum moss, of course, is very important for the people, the indigenous people of the area. It can hold 18 times its own weight in water, but of course it fills in it gradually grows into swampy areas, and it looks like a solid surface. But the minute you step on it, you're going to disappear out of sight. And you go and read the stories of the American Army trying to build the Alaska Highway back in the war, and whole bulldozers just sinking out of sight into these muskeg swamp areas.
But here's my question about the thawing permafrost.
Well, as it thaws out, of course, the methane from it is released into the atmosphere. That's what they're arguing. And they're arguing that with global warming, this will increase. And since methane's a greenhouse gas, it's going to cause this problem.
Got it. So that's what that's about.
Yes.
But how come the permafrost thaws out? What could be making it thaw out?
Well, it's not thawing out. Remember I mentioned earlier about going up the side of the mountain or going up the side up in latitude?
Yes.
And you reach a point of the permanent snow line, and of course beyond that, the snow doesn't melt in the summertime, and the permafrost doesn't melt in the summertime. And so what they're arguing is that as the world warms up, that line of permanent snow line is retreating up the sides of the mountains, which of course then has effect on the glaciers, but it also has effect on the permafrost. And what I'm telling you is that the permafrost has been thawing out for the last 12, 15,000 years since the glaciers started to retreat. And so what's going on is perfectly natural. And by the way, Kim, one other thing, one of the reasons you haven't heard much about methane is because people like me and others were pointing out that the atmospheric level of methane, by their own measures, has decreased over the last 15 years, not increased. And there's another interesting part of this. When they started the methane story, and the permafrost was one of the early ones, and it's come back again, they started out by saying, oh, there was more termites. And there were more termites because of agriculture in Africa and clearing of the forest and so on. Then they discovered that the scientists had miscalculated by a factor of 4, so the termites were off the list. Then somebody said, well, it's because we're not trapping the beaver, and there's more beaver ponds and more muskeg and swamps, and therefore more methane being produced. And then that was shown to be false. And but one of the things that was never mentioned, they pointed the finger at the number of cattle, and there's no question cattle produce methane at both ends. In fact, they produce more methane from chewing the cud than they do from the other end. And that's only one half of the formula, because in the last 120 years in North America, we've gone from about 120,000 cows to about 86 million. So no question, cows produce methane, there's an increase. But on the other side